the gospel that we are in this liturgical cycle. Again, there's nothing that verifies that, but there is a long-standing tradition that indicates that that may have been. We know that John Mark was a disciple, and that's why he then traveled with St. Peter and then later with St. Paul. He was somebody that was already known to the community. And again, the tradition tells us that. Now, how did we ever arrive at that conclusion when there's nothing at all to indicate that? It comes from that little bitty couple of verses in the Passion account that we heard this weekend, when in the Garden of Gethsemane, they came to arrest Jesus. And you may recall, and again, it was just slipped in there. And so it may not have stood out as an outstanding detail of this whole story, which of course it's not. But there is that little thing where it says, there was a young man present who had only a linen cloth wrapped around his body. They seized him, and he dropped the cloth and fled away and ran away naked. Now, this is the only one of the 4 Passion accounts that little tidbit occurs. But this is why it's so important to be able to understand and recognize some of the things that are there. The presumption is, a long-standing presumption, that that young man who ran away naked was the evangelist Mark, John Mark. Because obviously that was something that was emblazoned in his mind from that occurrence. Included it in his account of what happened. Nobody else did. Because either nobody else was aware of it, or if they were aware of it, it wasn't a big deal. So what? There was a lot of amok running through there, slicing ears off with swords and, all of the rest of that stuff. And so for the others, it may not have been anything monumental and memorable. It was for him. Now, how does that play into anything else? Well, again, it's a stretch, but you have to try to fill in the details. It's sort of like doing an investigative report. What can we surmise from this? Well, if this young man, wrapped only in his linen cloth, had followed them out to the Garden of Gethsemane and was there in all of this when Jesus was arrested, then how did he know? Did he just happen to be wandering down the streets of Jerusalem in his linen cloth and found this group going up the Mount of Olives to the Garden of Gethsemane? That's a possibility. All things are possible, but probably highly unlikely. And so it may have been that this was Mark, and if it was in Mark's family home, that they were upstairs celebrating the Passover. And let's remember the fact that the Passover was not a quiet meal. Okay, the Passover was not a quiet meal, especially at the end, because the conclusion of the Passover meal was the singing of what the Jews referred to as the Hallel Psalms, from which we get the word Alleluia. And so it was a series of psalms at the end of the 150 of them, all of which begin with Hallel, Alleluia, and psalms were not recited. It's not like we do here with, reciting the psalm. They are songs, and they were exuberant songs. They were rejoicing songs. And if you were downstairs, you would have heard them singing those songs upstairs. And when it got quiet, you knew they were done. They had finished the ritual. And then it got very quiet because they left. And if that was your home as a young, inquisitive young man, probably in his mid to late teens at that point, you may well have followed. Where are they going now? And that would have put him in the assembly, soldiers and everybody else. That would have put him there to have them try to grab him as they were trying to grab anybody they could who was with Jesus. And they snagged the cloth, and he just decided to leave it and run. So again, that's how you kind of piece things together, using the information that you do have to fill in information that you don't have. And again, this is not, to use the phrase, gospel truth, but it is a widely believed and adhered to story to explain what all of this was about and why we come to the conclusion that the home of the Last Supper may have been John Mark's family, their home. They were the man who was mentioned in the gospel about the master of the house. So anyway, so there it is. Again, the meal that Jesus had in the book of glory, the red letter ones, because almost Jesus is talking nonstop through chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. But I had also mentioned last week, and had mentioned earlier as well, when we started, that it is widely accepted that the presentation, the layout of the Gospel of John may be an edited work. It may not be in its original format. Some of the chapters may have been rearranged, perhaps to try to make a more chronological ordering and presentation of things, whatever the reason. And today would be one of those days when we did chapter 14 last week. I had mentioned that 14, or at least part of 14, if not the whole thing, is those, not wanting to sound doubtful or whatever, let's just call it one of those misplaced chapters, one of those that had been moved. Because, again, what do we have? We get to the very end of chapter 14. Jesus finishes talking, and then he says to them, "Get up, let's go." And then all of a sudden, here's chapter 15. He's still talking. And here's 16, and he's still talking. And here's 17, and he's still talking. So it hardly seems believable that when he says, "Get up, let's go," and then they stay. Okay, so. Hence, when we get to chapter 18, where we are today, how does it begin? When he said this, so again, it kind of supports the idea that 14 is not where it belongs. Because if it ends, "Get up, let's go," then it makes pretty good sense with the next verse being, "When he said that." Because what is it that they were doing? When he said that, Jesus went out. He left. So if you say, "Get up, let's go," all right, he said that. Jesus goes out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden, traditionally referred to as the Garden of Gethsemane, not mentioned by name in John, to where there was a garden into which he and his disciples entered. Judas, his betrayer, also knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So it was not unusual. You know, a lot of times we think that Jesus went to the Mount of Olives just before he was arrested, that he went to the Garden of Gethsemane just once before he was arrested, because those are the only times we really think about it. But there are other references in these Gospels which would indicate that this was not the first time that they went there. They had met there before, and John verifies that fact, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. It was a nice meeting place outside of the hustle and bustle of Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives just outside. You know, if you wanted to get out of the city, away from the havoc, and in Jesus' case, to a place of safety, away from the Sanhedrin and the other leaders who were, as we know, have been out to get him from the start, it's a nice place to go. Judas, his betrayer, had often knew the place. So Judas got a band of soldiers and guards from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and went there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. So they came armed, no question about that. They were ready. And we already know it was night because John told us that in chapter 13, when Judas left. When Judas left, it was night, we're told. Jesus, knowing everything that was going to happen to him, went out and said to them, "Whom are you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus the Nazarene." He said to them, "I am." And again, hopefully in your Bibles, those words are capitalized. And so we're back to the tetragrammaton again. That word, that name of God, the self-proclaimed name of God, that of course you were not allowed to pronounce. We already saw that Jesus in chapter 12 especially got himself in trouble with the scribes and Pharisees because he had used that a couple of times. He said, you know, before Abraham came to be, I am. And they're, whoa, you're blaspheming. You're talking about yourself using the name of God. You can't do that. And they were ready to stone him for his blasphemy. He said to them, I am. Judas, his betrayer, was. Jesus said to them, I am. They turned away and fell to the ground. I should say, by the way, I should have said right from the start, and I'm sorry, that this Passion account, the John Passion account, is read every year on Good Friday. Again, last year, cycle A, we had the Matthew year, so we had Matthew's account. This year is cycle B, we have the Mark Passion. Next year, cycle C, the Luke Passion. And then we repeat again, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke, every third year. But John is read every year in the Good Friday liturgy. So we hear this one more than the others, no question about it. I don't know in our hearing how many of us were ever, because Good Friday carries with it all kinds of emotions and memories and things like that, and we may not focus in on little things at times. We focus on the bigger picture of what Good Friday is about. I don't know if it ever seemed strange to you if you were at Good Friday service and if you heard this, where it says to them, when Jesus said, I am, they all fell to the ground. What's that about? And it's just really very simple. Jesus had pronounced the unpronounceable. Jesus had just said the unsayable. Jesus just, in their mind, sinned seriously by an act of blasphemy. And they also knew that God doesn't tolerate that. And so to put it into just, I guess, very simple, plain terms, they knew that for such a grievous offense, somebody's going to get it. Somebody's going to get struck down. And so partly out of reverence, but mostly out of fear, because in a lightning storm, you don't want to be the one standing. And so, they hit the ground. They hit the ground because they were sure somebody's going to get it. Somebody's going to get it. So Jesus asked them again, "Whom are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus the Nazarene." Jesus said, "I told you that I am. So if you're looking for me, let these guys go." This was to fulfill what he had said, "I have not lost any of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. And again, with the details that John keeps giving us, the slave's name was Malchus. So this guy made it into the gospel. He's been remembered for centuries now. The slave's name was Malchus. I've told you before that this is the one where it gets mentioned in all of the Passion. This is the one thing that gives me the chills more than anything else. That's funny. But when you think of that this is a virtual melee in the darkness, and Peter pulls out this sword and manages to just carefully slice an ear off. I mean, you'd have to have surgical precision to be able to do that. And here in this, thinking, oh my gosh, that's way too close for comfort. Way too close. And to slice an ear and not take half the head with it, I mean, come on. Come on. But that is, when you think about it, whoa. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its scabbard. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father gave me?" John does not tell us, the way some of the others do, that Jesus put the ear back on. At least one of the other Gospels, the Passion account, tells us that Jesus touched the man and restored the ear. So, John just doesn't mention that. So poor Malchus is running around without a right ear. So the band of soldiers, the tribune, and the Jewish guard seized Jesus, bound him, and brought him to Annas first. Was rotated through. You served a year at a time. And so Caiaphas just happened to be the one whose turn it was this time, this year. And Annas, we're told, is his father-in-law. It was Caiaphas who had counseled the Jews that it was better that one man should die rather than the people. And we heard that last week, or the week before. We've already been through that passage. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Now the other disciple was known to the high priest, and he entered the courtyard of the high priest with Jesus. But Peter stood at a gate outside. So the other disciple, the acquaintance of the high priest, went out and spoke to the gatekeeper and brought Peter in. Then the maid, who was the gatekeeper, said to Peter, "You are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" Peter said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the guards were standing around a charcoal fire they had made because it was cold, and were warming themselves. Peter was also standing there keeping warm. No point letting a good fire go to waste. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his doctrine. Jesus answered, "I have spoken publicly to the world. I have always other together. Nothing in secret. Good transparency there. Why ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said. They'll know. When he had said this, one of the temple guards standing there struck Jesus and said, "Is that the way you answer the high priest?" Jesus said, "If I've spoken badly, then testify to the wrong. But if I've spoken rightly, then why are you hitting me?" Makes sense. Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, his son-in-law, who was the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing there keeping warm, and they said to him, "You are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" Peter denied it and said, "Nope, not I." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the one whose ear Peter had cut off, so it all comes back to haunt you, said, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" And again, it'd be hard. How would you remember anybody in that turmoil? Except you were the one with the sword. You were the one that trimmed off the ear of my cousin. Oh yeah, didn't I see you there? Again, Peter denied it, and immediately the cock crowed. Now they brought Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium. We really don't know anything much about John, anything that goes on in front of the high priest. We get a little bit in front of Annas, but then the denial, and it says Jesus from there to the praetorium, which was Pilate's residence. It was part of Pilate's residence. It was morning, and they themselves did not enter the praetorium in order not to be defiled, so that they could eat the Passover. Again, since it was part of Pilate's residence, and Pilate was a pagan, then if they entered the residence of a pagan, they were considered unclean. We see that later in the Acts of the Apostles, where Peter is accused of being unclean because he went and had lunch in the home of a Gentile. So here they're following the orders. They could not go in. So they're standing outside Pilate's residence, because if they went in, they would be considered ritually unclean. And if they were ritually unclean, then they could not, and again, we have to remember here that John does this, arranges all of this, situates it ahead of the Passover. And so it says here, so that they could eat the Passover. If they were considered unclean, they would not be allowed to have the Passover meal with their family. They could not go to the temple or the synagogue on the Sabbath, the day after. They were unclean. And so this is not the time to do that. You know, there may be other times where you could, you hate to say it, afford to be ritually unclean. You know, well, I can't go here and can't do that, whatever. But not during Passover. Not during Passover. And John will remind us of the fact that the Passover, the Sabbath during the Passover was a more solemn Sabbath. And so everybody went to the temple. Everybody went to the synagogue. Everybody went to church. And they couldn't afford not to be able to. So they stood outside. So Pilate came out to them and said, "What charge do you bring against this man?" They answered and said, "If he were not a criminal, we wouldn't hand him over to you." So, again, they don't really give an answer. Pilate's looking for specifics, and all they say, if he weren't a criminal, we wouldn't be bringing him here. So, in a sense, what they're saying to Pilate is, what's it to you? Doesn't make any difference what you think, it's what we think. And we think he's a criminal, so there. At this, Pilate said, now again, we have to remember Pontius Pilate. You know, in all likelihood, Pilate didn't want to be there. To be assigned to the Holy Land as the Roman governor was not a plum position by any means. There was a nice residence along the Mediterranean, and that's where Pilate mostly lived. He would come into Jerusalem when needed, but he preferred to live outside of Jerusalem, away from the madness. So again, you know, he's kind of irked. He's a little bit irked that they brought someone early in the morning. You know, let me sleep, for heaven's sake. And then they don't really answer. So Pilate says, take him yourselves, judge him according to your law. Now they throw the linchpin in there. The Jews answered, we do not have the right to execute anyone. Which they were correct. They did not have the right. Under Roman rule, capital punishment was reserved only to Roman judgment. This was one of those areas where we know that, yes, they tolerated kind of a puppet sort of whatever, wherever they took over and had held people in captivity. But they did it in a way where it wasn't hard captivity, it wasn't really oppressive, but it was oppressive enough if you were one of the captives. And so they allowed, for instance, Herod to continue to sit on the throne and have the title king, but his powers were curtailed. And so the Jews are right. In fact, they probably said this line, I'm sure, with a little bit of irritation and sarcasm. You know, if he were not a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over, and we can't execute anybody. We'd like to just be done with this ourselves, but we have to come to you. We have to talk to you about it. So, Pilate went back into the praetorium, summoned Jesus, and said, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus said, are you saying this on your own, or have others told you about me? And again, Pilate's just irritated. He says, I'm not a Jew, am I? It's your own people and your own chief priests who've handed you over. What have you done? Jesus said, my kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom did belong to me, attendants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom isn't here. So Pilate said to him, then you are a king. And of course, it doesn't get any easier for Pilate. Jesus says, you say that I am a king. I was born for this reason, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. So in other words, I haven't come in an earthly rule, in a kingly rule. I've come to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. Pilate says to him, what is truth? You know, again, he's trying to work this whole thing out. When he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said, I don't find any guilt in this man. But here he thinks he's got a way out. Okay? But you have a custom that I release one prisoner to you at Passover. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? They said, no. This is Barabbas. It says was a revolutionary. Mark gave us a little bit more detail about it, that Barabbas was in jail with some others for causing a riot, and they were accused of murder. There's probably a very good likelihood that Barabbas was part of the Zealot movement. The Zealots basically were kind of an underground subversive group whose purpose was to try to make life miserable for the Romans as much as they could. The hope was, of course, that if they made the Romans miserable and irritated enough, the Romans would just pack up and leave, and then they could restore everything back the way it was. We are told that Jesus chose a zealot as one of his disciples, Simon, not Simon Peter, the other Simon. If Barabbas was in Pilate's Roman jail for this riot and for murder, then in all likelihood, the victim that they killed was a Roman. So, in all likelihood, which would make sense if he was a zealot. Okay? Again, connect the dots. Connect the dots. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him scourged. Pilate's hoping that if I just do something, we can avoid this whole thing. The soldiers wove a crown out of thorns and placed it on his head and clothed him in a purple cloak. And they came to him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him repeatedly. Once more Pilate went out and said to the crowd, "Look, I'm bringing this man out so that you know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple cloak. And Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the guards saw him, "Crucify him, crucify him," Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I don't find him guilty." The Jews answered, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die because he made himself the Son of God." Now when Pilate heard this, he became even more afraid. He went back into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" Jesus did not answer him. So Pilate says, "You're not going to speak to me? Don't you know that I have power to release you and the power to crucify you?" Jesus said, "You wouldn't have any power over me at all if it hadn't been given to you from above. For this reason, the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." Consequently, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release him, you are not a friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." And again, we see here the hypocrisy of the whole situation. The Jews did not recognize Caesar. They hated Caesar. They hated the whole Roman domination. They wouldn't be upset if something bad happened to Caesar. And so here they're doing this suck-up job. You know, we heard that in the Passion this morning. "We have no king but Caesar." The one we don't recognize, but they didn't say that. "We have no king but Caesar." And so now they're playing off of Pilate. In a sense, it's blackmail. If you release him, then you can't call yourself a friend of Caesar. It's almost as if they're saying, "We're going to tell. We're going to report you that you released somebody who called himself a king, and any king then is opposed to Caesar, which makes you opposed to Caesar, which means you be in big trouble, baby." So they thought they had him one way or the other. When Pilate heard these words, and And again, John does not record for us the message that Pilate's wife sent him. Matthew does. Again, the Romans are very superstitious kind of people, and the wife sends a message to her husband as he's sitting on the judge's bench. Don't have anything to do with this guy. I've had a really bad day because of a dream that he was in, and I don't want you to have anything to do, because if that dream was an omen, we're in trouble. He took his place on the judge's bench in the place called Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was preparation day for Passover, and it was about noon. Hope maybe you notice in Mark's account that the timing was different. Normally we see he's on the cross for 3 hours. Mark has him on the cross for 6. It says Jesus was crucified at about 9 in the morning. And then at noon, things got dicey, and then finally he dies at 3, according to Mark. Again, just differences in the accounts as they are recorded for us. They crucified him there, with him and 2 others, one on either side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews." Now that was very common. This was not anything unusual for Jesus. Anytime somebody was the victim of capital punishment, and crucifixion was the most common form of capital punishment, they would go ahead and hang a sign over the person's head of what their crime was that they were being crucified for. And crucifixions generally took place outside the city, but they took place in well-traveled areas, along well-traveled roads. And crucifixions were extremely common, extremely common. It was the preferred method of capital punishment. We should also say that again, there are differing traditions. Did Jesus carry the entire cross the way we see depicted in most Stations of the Cross? Well, we don't know. If he did, it would be unusual. Again, here they say, just do it all at the same time. And in most cases, they left the vertical beams in place because the ground was too hard, too rocky, too difficult to dig new holes and try to set those things up where they'd stay. So once they had them up, they left them up in most cases. Again, there may have been an exception in Jesus' case where he may have been given the entire cross to carry, but that would not have been keeping with the tradition of Roman crucifixion. And in fact, as cumbersome as the cross is, as the traditional stations have Jesus falling 3 times, 3rd, 7th, and 9th, the reality is that if you carried only the crossbeam, there are those who would say that that really would have been the far more difficult challenge. It would be too easy to get leverage with the full cross. You could position it in such a way that you could keep going. With the crossbeam, they traditionally would put it behind the neck and put the arms over it. And that's how you had to walk, with this big beam behind you, which made it very difficult to keep your balance. And, you know, many would fall and probably fall backward more than forward, or you'd be leaning forward to try to keep from falling backward and fall flat on your face. So Again, Jesus' crucifixion may have been unique, but here's what normally happened with that. And so the sign over his head was very simple. He's being crucified, who he is, Jesus of Nazareth, and why he's being crucified, King of the Jews. Which, as you look, is what's up there. Ta-da! The traditional letters, I-N-R-I. We have to remember that in the Latin language, there is no letter J in their alphabet. The J words that we're used to always began with an I, the letter I. And so the INRI is just simply shorthand. It's an abbreviation for the Latin phrase, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Iudeorum. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And so that's what that means. That's why most of our crucifixes have that little sign. And everybody's wondering, what's INRI mean? What does INRI mean? Abbreviations. The chief priests came to Pilate, and they were still not happy. It's kind of like, here Jesus is crucified, getting their wish, and they go to Pilate and say, wait a minute, don't put King of the Jews, but put down, he said, I am the King of the Jews. And Pilate, of course, at this point is just had it with them. He's just had it with them, and he says, quod scripsi scripsit. What I have written, I have written. So leave me alone. I'm not changing a thing. He had reached his limit. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them up into 4 shares, a share for each soldier. They also took his tunic, but the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top down. They said it wouldn't do us any good that way, but let's throw dice to see whose it will be. In order for the passage will be fulfilled that says, they divided my garments among them, and for my vesture they cast lots. They threw dice. And it's not hard to imagine soldiers doing a little dice game. And this is what they did. Now, standing by mother, wife and Mary of Magdala. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple there whom he loved, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. It's very interesting. What is Jesus referring to there? And actually, I think in many ways it's probably double intended. He's saying, look at your son, but saying, look at this beloved disciple here. There's going to be an exchange. There's going to be a handoff. Look at what they've done to me. Look at my situation. And look at him. And he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. No question there who he's referring to. And from that hour on, the disciple took Mary into his home. After this, aware that everything was now finished, so Jesus had done everything that needed to be done, in order that the scripture would be fulfilled, he said, I am thirsty. There was a vessel filled with common wine, so they put a sponge soaked in the wine on a sprig of hyssop and put it up to his lips. When Jesus had taken the wine, he said, It is finished. And bowing his head, he handed over his spirit. Now, since it was the preparation day for the Passover and Sabbath, in order that the bodies might not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath day of that week was a solemn one. We already talked about that. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs be broken and that they be taken down. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and then of the other who was crucified with Jesus. Again, strange situations, but we have to know the tradition. What's the big deal about breaking legs? Well, we have to remember that the main suffering, we think about nails being put into your hands and feet. Yeah, that's pretty bad. But the main excruciation was suffocation. And as the body sagged on the cross, it became harder and harder to breathe because the lungs were filling up with fluid. And if you wanted to get a good breath, then you hoisted yourself up. And again, that was not easy because your feet were nailed flat against the wood with, and you'd have to put weight on those feet and weight on the nails, but it was worth trying to draw a better breath. And when they would come and break the legs, they could not lift themselves up to draw that better breath. And so the suffocation came on faster. So they wanted to get these guys off the cross. They didn't want bodies hanging on the Sabbath. Break the legs. Very simply done. The soldiers would take their lance, put them between the legs, and just pull. Very ugly. Very ugly. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, so they didn't break his legs. There was no point in doing that. But one of the soldiers thrust his lance into his side, and immediately blood and water flowed out, and that would make sense. Again, in suffocation, the lungs filling up with fluid, the blood, obviously, because you've stabbed the body. An eyewitness has testified, and his testimony is true. He knows he is speaking the truth, so that you also may believe. We're back to that again. For this happened so that the scriptures would be fulfilled. Not a bone of his will be broken. And another scripture which says, they will look on him whom they have pierced. After this, Joseph of Arimathea, secretly a disciple of Jesus for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate if he could take down the body. Pilate permitted it. So Joseph came and took down the body. Nicodemus, the one who had first come to Jesus during the night, back in chapter 3, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes weighing about 100 pounds. They took the body of Jesus and bound it with burial cloths along with the spices, according to Jewish burial custom. Now in the place where he had been crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been buried. So they laid Jesus there because of the Jewish preparation day, for the tomb was close at hand. So again, if it was about 3 p.m. when Jesus died, and we talk about the 12 hours of daylight, sundown, dusk coming at about 6 p.m, they didn't have a whole lot of time to get the body down, to clean it up, to get it ready for burial, and then to carry it away to a tomb. And so the reality was, here's a tomb. Tradition again says it was Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. He said, here, use mine. It's close. We can get done. Because they still had to walk back home and be home before the sun went down, because the Sabbath would begin, and you could only walk so far once the Sabbath began. Again, a lot of that is unknown to us. A lot of that may seem foolish to us. The restrictions that they had about what they could and could not do. You can only walk so far. You could only carry things that were so big or so heavy. That's why in the Gospels, if you remember the guy who was cured by Jesus and told, pick up your mat and walk, and it was a Sabbath, and they jumped all over his case because you couldn't carry a mat on the Sabbath. That was considered work. Couldn't do it. So they had to hurry. Here's the tomb, let's get them in. And they didn't do it, they did not do a total job. It was a rush job. Try to get them in as quickly as possible. And that was one of the reasons why we're told that the women were waiting for sunrise on the morning after the Sabbath so that they could go to the tomb. And they were going to go to the tomb with the rest of the stuff that they needed to do a proper job of body preparation and burial. John records for us his memory of the resurrection. And we need to realize that as, if we were to go through and look at the four Gospels and look at the resurrection stories, the details are different. The details are different. John here has Mary Magdalene alone. Another one of the Gospels has two women coming to the tomb. Another one identifies three women coming to the tomb. The fourth one just says some women. It does not specify how many. In some cases, they see one angel. In some cases, they see two angels. So again, the details are different. Doesn't change the story, doesn't change the impact of the story. It just means that the traditions that were handed down and included in these Gospels, written several years after the events, were remembered differently. Mary of Magdala came to the tomb early in the morning while it was still dark, and she saw the stone removed from the tomb. So she turns around and runs and goes to Simon Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loved and said, "Guess what? They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they put him." I don't know who the "they" is, but I'm sure in their mind it was the Jewish leaders. And they would see this as another insult leveled at Jesus. They have taken him from the tomb, and we don't know where they put him. So Peter and the other disciple went out and came to the tomb. They both ran, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter because he was much younger than Peter, and arrived at the tomb first. He bent down and saw the burial cloths there, but did not go in. When Simon Peter arrived after him, he went into the tomb. That's just so typical of a description of Peter. Charge right in. Open your mouth. Swear you're not going to deny. Peter is that kind of impulsive sort of person. The beloved disciple is outside, maybe giving room for Peter to be the first one in, out of respect for Peter. But Peter comes along and does not disappoint. Boom, charges right on in. He saw the burial cloths there, and the cloth that covered the head, not with the burial cloths, but rolled up in a separate place. Then the other disciple also went in, and again, John is such a master of the obvious, the one who arrived first. Well, there wasn't anybody else there. There weren't any other disciples there. He saw and believed. For they did not yet understand the scriptures that he had to rise from the dead. And then the disciples went back home. So in a sense, Mary Magdalene goes, the stone is rolled back, the tomb is empty, nothing else is there. She doesn't know what to think about it. She goes and finds the other disciples, probably in that upper room, says, guess what? He's gone. They've taken him. Peter and John go running. They get to the tomb, they look, they see the burial cloths, they see the tomb empty, and in a sense they kind of go, yeah, well, she was right. He's not here. What else do we make this out to be? We don't know. So they went home. There was no point standing around. It's not going to bring him back. Bob. Yeah. Yep. But it also says that, and this was supposedly written by the beloved disciple, it also says they did not understand the scriptures about the resurrection. But they go back. But Mary of Magdala stays outside the tomb weeping. As she wept, she bent over into the tomb and saw two angels in white sitting there, one at the head, one at the feet where the body had been. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you crying?" She said, "Because they've taken my Lord, and I don't know where they've put him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus, but didn't recognize him. He said to her, same thing that the angel said, "Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for?" Now she thought that he was the gardener, because again, this tomb was in a garden. She thought he was the gardener and said to him, "If you're the one who carried him away, tell me where you put him, and I will go and take him." Now again, just think of what was said. You're the one who tell me, and I'll go and take him. Did Mary Magdalene really think that she would have had the physical strength to be able to go and take a dead body, dead weight? But again, that's what extreme duress and emotion, all of those things, confusion, doubt, fear, frustration, that's what those things can do to you. That's what those things can do to you. You can say things without really thinking about what you've just said. Jesus says to her, "Mary." And we're not sure how he said it, but however he said it, it was in a very familiar tone. Maybe it was kind of said like a nickname or something, we don't know. But however he said it, immediately she says to him, "Rabboni," teacher. Just in the way he said her name, she recognized who this was. Jesus said to her, "Stop holding on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go and to my brothers and tell them, I'm going to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary of Magdala went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and what Jesus had told her. This is important because Mary Magdalene then becomes the first person to announce the resurrection. She was sent by Jesus to do that. And she went and told the others, "He is risen, I have seen him." That is the definition, a biblical definition of a disciple. It is one who witnessed and then would proclaim that Jesus is risen. That's why Mary Magdalene, each saint is identified in some way or another, often by their lifestyle, by their job, whatever it might be, martyr, bishop, priest, religious. Mary Magdalene is identified in that listing as the disciple to the disciples. She's the first to do the work of a disciple, to announce the resurrection. On the evening of that first day of the week, where the doors were locked, where the disciples were out of fear of the Jews, Jesus came, stood among them, and said to them, "Peace be with you." It's very similar to what he would say otherwise, "Do not be afraid." So he needed to calm them down. I mean, here they were. They didn't let him in the door. He didn't crawl in the window. He just stands in front of them now. He appears to them and says, "Peace be with you." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven them, and whose sins you retain are retained." One of the things you will not find in any of the four Gospels, you will not find a 40-day period of time between the resurrection and the ascension. It is not there. And yet we have the tradition of the ascension coming on the 40th day. That tradition comes out of the Acts of the Apostles, where it says to them, Jesus appeared to them over a period of 40 days. But not in any of the four Gospels. And so what we have here, in a sense, again, in a sense, in what we've just heard, we've had the resurrection, obviously, because this is Easter day and Easter night. Jesus appears to them, and what does he do? As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. What? To witness to me, to the resurrection, to the gospel. Jesus do that at the ascension. Jesus commissions them at the ascension to go into the world. When he said this, he breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." And where does that take place? At Pentecost. But again, Pentecost is reported and recorded in the Acts of the Apostles right after we've heard that there was 40 days before the ascension, and then 10 more days until the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. But at least here, for the gospel, it seems as if everything gets compressed. Because this is essentially going to be it. The Gospels do not give us a whole bunch of time after that. Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, happened not to be with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples said, "We have seen the Lord." But Thomas said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, put my finger in those nail marks, and put my hand up into his side, I will not believe." Now, all the way through, we've been seeing believe, 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 do not consist, and all of a sudden here's somebody saying, nope, that's not it. I am not going to believe. I will not believe. Unless and until. Now, a week later, the disciples were once again inside, and this time Thomas was with them. Jesus came, although the doors were locked, stood in their midst and said, "Peace be with you." So he's repeating what he had did the week before. Then he says to Thomas, "Here, put your finger here and see my hands, and bring your hand and put it into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believe." Thomas answered and said, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you come to believe?" Where did we hear that before? And Martha, when Martha meets Jesus, when he comes her brother, and Jesus says, "Do you believe?" And what does she say? "I have come to believe." Jesus asks, "Have you now come to believe because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed." The letter to the Hebrews tells us that faith is the confident assurance of things not seen. And so this is leading up to that. It's all kind of connected together. Once something is seen, it's no longer a matter of faith or belief. It's a fact. It's a fact. So blessed are those who have not seen and have believed, because that's the true witness of faith. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. We know that because we only took 7 of the signs. But these are written that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through this faith, through this belief, you will have life in his name. So the whole purpose of this is to help us come to believe. In line with Martha, in line with Thomas, in line with a lot of the others who have come to believe. Doesn't necessarily mean that faith is like a light switch, on, off, instantaneous. It's more of a process. I have come to believe. And so ends the Gospel of John. Whoops. Whoops. Somewhere, chapter 21 came in. And again, probably added on, edited in by some of the evangelists' own disciples. And it may be things that they remembered hearing from him that they looked and were not written down. They decide to add an addendum, an epilogue. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. He revealed himself this way. Together were Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, Zebedee's sons, which would be James and John, and 2 others. So how many does that give us? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 out of the remaining 11, so that's not too bad. Simon Peter says to them, I'm going fishing. You know, probably, I mean, it makes sense. This had been a very trying time, a very difficult time, a very emotional time. And they're still trying to sort through it all and figure it all out. And you could just kind of imagine that they're all worked up and all tensed up. And Peter just says, I got to go do something that I know, something that I'm familiar with. And so he says, I'm going fishing. I got to get out of here. I need to go fishing. And they all kind of go, good idea. We'll go with you. So they get out into the boat, and that night they catch nothing. Nothing. Not a single thing. Nothing. And can you imagine, with professional fishermen, how challenging that would be? All night long, because they mostly fished at night. They fished at night because it was cooler for them, and because it was cooler, the fish were closer to the surface. They weren't down as deep, so they didn't have to cast as far. All night, nothing. When it was dawn, Jesus was standing at the shore, but the disciples didn't realize that it was him. Jesus calls out, children, have you caught anything to eat? That's kind of like rubbing salt in the wound, you know, at least as far as they interpreted it. They said, no. So he said to them, then cast the net to the right side of the boat and you will find something. And again, my image here is very simple. It's, you know, do you think we didn't throw the net to the right side of the boat? I've been out here all night. I've done left side, right side, front side, back side. Can't tell you how many times we threw this net out. Throw the net to the right side of the boat. Okay. So they did. And they were not able to pull it in because of the large number of fish. So the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, this is one of those obvious little moments, I think, it's the Lord. I mean, who else could have done that, right? So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he tucked in his garment, for he was lightly clad, and he jumped into the sea. And without going into a whole lot of detail, as you know, this is one of those places where I have some questions. First of all, why did he jump into the sea? Secondly, which side of the boat did he jump out of? And we could ask, well, what difference does it make? Well, did he jump out of the side of the boat away from the shore so the boat would kind of hide him from Jesus' glance? Because remember, he had denied him 3 times. He was still a little embarrassed about that moment. Or did he jump out toward the shore? And they could not have been all that far that Jesus was able to stand on the shore and call out to them, have you caught anything? And maybe he wanted to get there first before the others could haul that net in with all those fish. Anyway, he jumps into the water. The other disciples came in the boat, for they were not far from shore, only about 100 yards, dragging the net with the fish. When they climbed out on shore, they saw a charcoal fire with fish and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you just caught." So Simon Peter went over. Now, again, they could barely, all of them together, could barely haul the net. They dragged that net behind their boat. It took everything they all had together. And Simon Peter goes and drags the net ashore all by himself. Either he was really one strong guy or something. 153 large fish. And you know, you've seen already how many details John puts into this gospel. Not 152, not 154, 153. And nobody knows for sure exactly why, the significance of 153. One has suggested that at that particular time there were 153 known languages. And so by collecting 153, you're collecting the whole world. In a sense, if Jesus is sending them out into the whole world, here's the conglomeration of that whole world in the 153 fish. Even though there were so many, the net was not torn, thanks be to God, because there may have been 154th and it slipped out. You don't know. Jesus said, "Come, have breakfast." And none of the disciples dared to ask, "Who are you?" Because they realized it was the Lord. They hadn't a few minutes ago, but now they did. Jesus came over, took the bread, and gave it to them, and in like manner the fish. This was now the third time Jesus was revealed to his disciples after being raised from the dead. First time was Easter Sunday night. Second time was the week later with Thomas. And now John is telling us this is the third time. And that's a pattern that we saw before. Remember when he went back to Cana and worked one of the signs, this was now the second sign that Jesus worked at Cana. So somebody's keeping tallies. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And the question I have, is really simple. How did Jesus intend that question? Do you love me more than you love these other ones? Or do you love me more than these other ones love me? Either way, it's an important question. Simon Peter quickly says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." He then said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Tend my sheep." Then Jesus says a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" The evangelist tells us Peter was distressed that he had been asked a third time, "Do you love me?" I wonder if he was as distressed as he was when the cock crowed the second time and he realized he had denied Jesus 3 times as Jesus had predicted. "Lord, you know everything," Peter said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Amen, amen, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to dress yourself and go wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this, signifying the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And when he had said this, he said to Peter, "Follow me." This particular happening, this encounter, this conversation, this questioning, many have said is John's equivalent of Matthew 16. in which Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. I will entrust to you the keys to the kingdom of heaven." And so it's Jesus, by saying, "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, tend my sheep." What's that saying? Take care of the flock. Take care of the flock. I am the good shepherd. Remember, we've already heard that. I lay down my life for my sheep. Now you, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, tend my sheep. Follow me. Follow in my footsteps. As I have cared for them, now you care for them. As I gave my life for them, so you give your life for them. Follow me. Peter turned and caught sight of the disciple following whom Jesus loved, the one who had reclined against his chest during the supper, and said, "Master, who is the one who will betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "And what about him?" And what about him? All right, if this is what I have to do, I mean, this was a burden. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep, follow me. If this is what I have to do, what does he have to do? I mean, he's your favorite. You know, he's the one who sat next to you at the supper. He's the one to whom you entrusted your mother. What about him? What is he going to have to do? Jesus said, "What if I want him to remain until I come? What business is that of yours? You must follow me." So the word spread among the brothers that that disciple would not die. But Jesus hadn't said that he wouldn't die. He just said, "What if I want him to remain until I come? What business is that of yours?" You have to appreciate the humanity of these guys. Here he just gets entrusted with the whole ball of wax. And his first concern is, what does he get to do? What does he have to do? If I have to do these things, what about him? And you have to appreciate Jesus' comment, "Mind your own business. The only thing you have to worry about is what I've told you to do. He'll have to worry about what I tell him to do, whatever that is, but it's none of your business." Oh, how well Jesus knew human nature. How well he knew how nosy people would be. Mind your own business. It is this disciple who testifies to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true. So the conclusion is basically what it was in chapter 20. There are also many other things that Jesus did, but now we get the exaggeration. But if there were to be described individually, I don't think the whole world could contain all the books that would need to be written. So in a sense, they're trying to say why the gospel is as short as it is, why it covers what it did, why maybe it only included the 7 signs. We couldn't put any more in. We wouldn't have room in the world for all the books we'd need, because Jesus was busy. Well, I hope that these 6 weeks have helped give a little understanding to the 4th gospel. Again, because it's so unique and so different from the other 3 synoptic gospels, that it really is in a place by itself. It's kind of like what we saw in the beginning of chapter 20, where it said the cloth that had covered the head was rolled up in a place by itself. That's kind of where this gospel is. It's in a place by itself. So enjoy it, not only on Good Friday, but enjoy it in the upcoming Easter season, starting next Sunday, because it is the Gospel of John that is read almost exclusively throughout the 50 days of Easter. And so, you'll be able to say, oh, I heard that. I remember that. Oh, that's what Jesus meant. And that's the advantage that we want in our understanding. So, again, thank you, and thanks to Sherry for putting us on the air these weeks, and for all of those folks who have been joining us and following along from home, some of whom have contacted me to tell me that they've been following along at home. And we'll see you next Lent. We'll pick something else to look at. Have a good rest of the day. I will see some of you at 3, some of you at 5, some of you at 3 and 5. And if anybody wants to come back at 7, by all means, you're welcome. I won't be here, but you're welcome to come back at 7. So have a good afternoon. Be careful. It's a little windy out there, just a tad bit.